Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at my talk. I am Aakanksha, and I will be presenting about unmasking APTs and how we developed an automated approach for real-world threat attribution. So as I mentioned, I'm Aakanksha, and this is a work in collaboration with my advisors, Professor Blasco from UPM, who's right here with me today, Professor Cavallaro from UCL, and Professor Martina from TU Wien. So before we begin, a bit about myself and what makes me qualified to talk about this stuff. I am a third-year PhD student at TU Wien, working in the Security and Privacy Research Unit. There, I have a master's degree from University of Utah, specializing in cybersecurity. And previously, I also worked as a red teamer at Microsoft, where we reverse engineered malicious samples and looked into some APT samples as well. And that's where my interest for APTs come in. And finally, currently, I'm extremely passionate about using machine learning to solve security problems. And that's where this topic falls under. And during my fun time, if the weather permits, I like to do stargazing. And how does the agenda for today looks like? We will briefly introduce APTs and how its attribution looks like in the current scenario. We are going to delve a little bit deeper into the current complexities and challenges in attribution, which kind of motivates us to propose our system ADAPT, which is an automated machine learning-based attribution approach. We also develop a strategy to evaluate ADAPT on a data set that we curated. And finally, we conclude with next steps and some insights. So in 2015, several Bundestag members, German Bundestag members, which is the parliament members from Germany, were affected by some hackers that were supposedly backed by Russia. And the whole idea was they had these campaigns aligned to Russian interests, and they wanted to get some secret sensitive data from these Bundestag members. And usually these sophisticated attacks against these specific targets that have a very specific objective are known as advanced persistent threats. And they often have these experienced team of cyber criminals behind them who are well organized and typically well funded. And when you think about APTs, the next thing you often think about is attribution. So in a very generic term, when you associate a cyber attack to an attacker, it is what an attribution is being called attribution. So when the Bundestag attack happened in 2015, it was in October 2020 when the European Union announced sanctions against some Russian military officers who were attached to this group called APT28, also known as Fancy Bear, and some other aliases that we have been tracking APT28 as. So this idea of linking an activity to a known threat group or an actor is what is termed as threat attribution. And when it comes to threat attribution, what do we like to do? Well, we definitely like to have fun and are very creative. We have come up with this APT nomenclature where we started associating Helix Kitten, Charming Kitten, with Iranian-based threat actors. Then we have all kinds of pandas, aquatic panda, sunrise panda, for China-based threat actors. And as we saw in our previous slide, we had Fancy Bear, Primitive Bear for threats originating from Russia. And it's interesting that as the number of APT actors kept growing, we kept adding to this nomenclature, and now we have leopards and tigers for South Asian-based threat actors. Specifically, we have rattlesnake for an Indian-based threat actor. And it's just crazy how this murky world of APT attacks, with its ever-growing number of actors, and compounded by the lack of clarity in publicly available information, it's becoming really hard to tell who's who in this cyber zoo. So as you can see, I'm alluding to the fact that attribution is challenging, and it has its complexities. So as researchers and security practitioners working in academia, we have identified some bottleneck that can make attribution challenging and can add to the complexities. So let's look into some of these challenges. So the very first thing we have identified is this variation in campaigns. No longer threat actors are going for a one objective, one entity kind of thing, where you know that this campaign, which was supposedly targeting a financial institution, is related to this APT actor X. Now they are crafting these unique campaigns that they keep modifying based on the organization and the objectives that they are targeting. So for example, there is a threat group 1, It is running two different campaigns, X and Y, completely using different attack vectors and payloads. While the threat campaign X is focused on industrial control system, the threat campaign Y is more focused towards financial institutions. And what happens is security vendors start tracking these campaigns from different perspectives, and they kind of start forming an incomplete understanding about the adversary. We have these overlapping and fragmented information. We don't know that these two threat campaigns are the act of the same threat group who is operating these campaigns. And secondly, we all know and might agree with that this is one of the common problems where we see these shared similarities among the threat groups. So this is an actual case where Sidewinder, which I mentioned, is an Indian-based threat actor, and Transparent Tribe is another threat actor which targets South Asian countries. They ended up using the same VBA macro code in their document. There were two different threat groups, and analysts, until they analyzed the complete attack chain. And it took them some years to make the connection that they are two different groups, but at first they attributed both the attacks to Sidewinder, and it resulted in misattribution and erroneous attribution. And moreover, we know that APT actors reuse code, they share tooling, and in a recent report released by Mandiant in 2023, they identified these multiple subgroups of Lazarus, which is a North Korean threat actor, and how they have been assigned to do specific tasks. And it just adds to the complexity, because if you cannot confidently track an activity to an entity, you either do misattribution, you do erroneous attribution, and you cannot confidently say that this attack was linked to this actor. Moreover, on the technical side of the front, these APT attacks are made up of these different file types in their attack chain. It's never just an executable. It's never just a document. They are like these chain of payloads that you have to analyze. And sometimes it takes days, months, and years for analysts to manually analyze these payloads and connect them to a threat actor or a threat group. As you saw in the Bundestag example, that happened in 2015, but it wasn't attributed until 2020, once they identified all the artifacts and connected it to the APT28 group. So what I'm trying to say is, we have to identify these concepts and these different these ideas that come into place when you are attributing an APT. You have the idea of threat group, which we all know is the entity behind these attacks, but you also need to identify that there is this concept of threat campaign, which is not always analogous to threat group. You can have multiple threat campaigns, and as we know that vendors start attributing malware, keep the malware names as the campaign names as the threat group names, but that's not always the case. And then when you think about threat campaigns, they have these multiple files within their attack chain. So in light of these challenges, and when we identify that there is these concepts we need to differentiate and disassociate, we came up with our approach, ADAPT. I'm sorry for the short name, that is the best we can come up with, but it stands for Attribution of Diverse APT Samples. And the diversity comes from the fact that we differentiate our approach from the prior work that has been done in this area, which focuses either on executables. We want to take care of all the heterogeneous files that are in the attack chain. So our approach takes care of all the different file types. Our feature extraction and clustering make sure that we work with a uniform sample set. And then moreover, as I mentioned, the campaign and the group level, we do attribution at two levels. So the first is the campaign level, where we are more interested in identifying the characteristics of the attack. Here we look into the sample status, the techniques that they are using, and try to identify if a sample could be a part of an APT campaign. What that helps is, if you have seen a sample that has same tactics and techniques used prior, you can actually prioritize the detection and mitigation. Moreover, when you look at the group attribution, we are more interested in the characteristics of the attacker there and not the attack. And this is where we separate ourselves. We focus on a different set of features and characteristics, and that in turn helps with forensic investigation and indictments. So, in a nutshell, ADAPT is an automated machine learning-based attribution approach where we're trying to do a systematic approach to attribution by separating it at campaign level and group level. With that said, let's go look into our system design and look at the different phases that constitute ADAPT and how we achieve our goals. As I said, I am into stargazing, so I thought I'll show some pretty pictures to kind of convey the idea of the different phases that we have. We start with data set collection. We rely on open source APT samples that have been identified, and we collect those raw APT samples in our data set collection phase. Once we have that, we do feature extraction, where we extract statically raw features from these samples. And once we do that, we transform them to a higher dimensional space, which is where our feature transformation comes in to make them suitable for our machine learning algorithms. And finally, we do clustering, where we focus on campaign and group level clustering based on the features that we identified from these samples. With that said, our first phase, data set collection. So we completely rely on open source here. We use the platform called Alien Vault, which is a very popular platform for companies and researchers to share information about the emerging threats. And we are actually thankful for Alien Vault because they have like a super nice API where you can just give the APT tag and it will extract all the related APT hashes that it has seen and the researchers have tagged. We also extracted APT labels from them because usually when researchers analyze these samples, they also tag it with the APT group that they identified it. So we extract that. But to download the samples, we rely on VirusTotal. So we had the researcher access to VirusTotal, and we were able to download the samples. And as a result, we had 6,545 samples in our data set. And again, I mentioned that we are not just focusing on binaries. We actually ended up with around 22 plus different file types in our data set. We will get to it later. And then the number of APT groups that were distributed in our data set was about 172 APT groups. So as I said, data set quality, file type. I'm sorry if the x-axis might look a little too messy, but what I want to focus is definitely, if you see the first two bars, it is the Windows 32 EXE and Windows 32 DLL that makes up for the majority of our file type. We had around 3,600 files belonging to this category. But we would also like to focus on this next set of files that makes up our data set, which is, well, not surprising, but still you can see that the top four are the Word or the document-based file formats. We have the OXML, the MS Word, the RTF, Excel, and surprisingly, we have a lot of Android files in our data set as well, and following up with link files, which are the Windows shortcut, and zip files. So that kind of emphasizes more that we need to look into these different file types that we are seeing in this landscape, and we need to take into account that any approach or systematic attribution that we do takes care of these different file types to make an attribution claim. Moving on, this is the fun part. When we looked into the group labels in our data set, we identified that around 35% of our samples have more than one label attached to it. And you might all know where this problem coming from is from us having these different aliases and nomenclature. So this is just a snippet from Microsoft Threat Actor Naming Convention where they moved on to the new name of weather-based, but they also had to unlist these other names, which are like Primitive Bear and Cameradon for actinium that they used to previously track with, and so on and so forth. So, and this is just the lower bound. Like in our data set, we saw some amount of samples that had 15 names associated with some 2% of the samples in our data set. So this is just the lower bound. But yeah, this is a problem. Like if you create a system and if you want to do robust evaluation, you just cannot do when the ground truth is not right. So just curiosity, show of hand, who thinks that this is an actual problem and we need to do something about this? Okay, okay, good to know. So yes, so we struggled with this because we were working with machine learning-based systems. We had to have proper evaluation, and if we need to evaluate something, we need to have proper ground truth labeling. So what did we do? We had a rigorous relabeling process where we literally looked through the samples. We had 2 researchers assigned on the data set. They looked through the threat reports. They identified, they standardized any aliases. And we try to have a consistent naming scheme. We do not say that something is right or something is wrong, but we feel that we want to move away from the textual names. So we try to have a consistent naming scheme of APTs, XX, FTA for threat actor XX and FIN for financially based threat groups. So wherever possible, we remove the aliases, we move to a consistent naming convention, and we also removed any non-unique samples or non-APT samples. So interestingly, a couple of hundred of samples in our data set belong to the stolen red team tools that were stolen during the FireEye, during the SolarWinds campaign. So that were not really attacker samples, but thankfully, because of this relabeling and cleaning process, we realized that those does not belong there. So we removed that, and finally, we ended up with 6,134 samples, but only assigned to 92 groups. So you can see that from 174, we went to a reduction of 92 groups. So that means that we might not have that many APT groups we might think, so just by relabeling process and cleaning process. So just a thought out there. Yeah, so now we deal with this clean data set right here. So in the spirit of open source, we have also released our standardized group label data set at this URL, so feel free to explore the data set, leave any feedback or comment if you have any. And I would also like to point out that our work is currently under academic publication. So we are going through this blind review process. Once our paper is out, we will publish our paper with more details and our source code as well, so you can have a look at that at the same URL. Moving on to feature extraction. So as I mentioned, we only focus on static analysis to extract features from the heterogeneous files that we have in our data set. And also, I would like to point out here that we do not reinvent any wheel. We are actually using very popular malware forensics tool we believe the community has developed. They are really great. They work flawlessly. We just had to make some changes to automate it and make it work with our data set. So we are not using any new tool or not creating any new tool. So in that regard, we rely on Floss, which is a very good tool for extracting strings from all the samples. So that gave us the strings from the samples. Then we also rely on Yara rules, specifically the Malcat rule set to identify any rules trigger within our sample set. And then we use EXIF tools to extract file metadata. These are all open source tools. You can use it. You can use their libraries to automate it, and that's what we did. And as I said, that the two dominant file types in our data set were executable and documents. So we also employ specific tools to extract features from them, and these being OLE tools, which is another very popular, commonly available malware forensics tool for documents. It gave us the presence if a VBA macro code is present in a document or any suspicious strings. And then Leaf is another library for instrumenting executable file formats. And we were able to extract API calls and library names and imported and exported functions from our executable file formats. So now that we have these features, how do we actually use these different feature categories to do our attribution? As I said, we do campaign level and group, and campaign is more about the sample-related features, more about the attack itself. So we combine the specific and the generic feature, the generic which I mentioned, the strings, the Yara rules, along with the specific features that we get for documents and executable file formats, and that really helps us identifying the capabilities of a sample itself and in turn do campaign attribution. But when we do group attribution, we introduce an interesting set of features that we believe could be distinctive patterns for a threat actor or a threat group, and we call them linking features. So what are these linking features? We divide these linking features, and this has been used by threat analysts already. Like, they know that these infrastructure traits and operational patterns could be interesting linking traits that could identify a threat group or threat actor. So in that regard, we have these regular expression-based patterns that we try to extract from the strings of the files that we already got from the Floss, as I mentioned. So in this, we were particularly looking for things like any URL present within the string content, any IP addresses that we might have uncovered, any file paths that the sample might have accessed. And we were also looking for Bitcoin addresses, email addresses, any Slack tokens, API keys, because that could be a good indicator of a threat group or an actor behind it. Moreover, we also rely on Census open source threat intelligence to extract second-level features on our URLs and IP addresses. We believe that URL and IP address in itself would not be a good indicator, so we go a bit extra. And for the IP addresses, we were also interested to look at the BGP prefixes and the ASN number and country code. And for the URLs or any domain names, we were interested in certificate fingerprints or the issuer organization of the URL that it might be calling in the sample. So with this combination of which we call like pattern-based and infrastructure traits, we believe that we could actually be making the right attribution claims when we do group-level attribution. Moving on to feature transformation. So here, as I mentioned, we were working with heterogeneous file types, and we had features from all these different sources. So we had to do a couple of transformation steps to make sure that they are compatible for the machine learning algorithms. So this was a process which we had to do, which is called normalization. We had to make sure that a feature means the same across different file types. So when you get a language code for a document, it ideally means the resource language of executable. So we had to make sure that we normalize across different file types so they mean the same. Next, we use one-hot encoding, which is a very popular technique also used in prior work where we convert these categorical features. So let's say a sample triggered the following Yara rules of the compiler, the linker, keylogger, API. So we explode the list of all the Yara rules in our data set that were captured. And then we assign true to the ones for this sample that was triggered, so either true or 0. And then we get our one-hot encoding. Moving on to string vectorizers, so since we had string features, we had to deal with them. So definitely that needs a lot of pre-processing and cleaning. And once we were able to remove some garbage string, we kind of employed this technique, count vectorizer. Again, a popular technique have been used in prior research, where what it does is it counts the frequency of each string token without the sample, and then it represents a vectorized table like this. So if you have two samples which triggered, let's say, the following two string dictionary, and it just converts them to a vectorized table where it counts the frequency of each string token per sample. And finally, we also employ a sentence transformer model to do word embedding, and this was specifically useful for us. So what it does is it encodes the textual pattern-based feature, let's say, into a compact vector space, and tries some kind of a similarity score to identify near similar features. So let's say a sample that calls the dropbox.com versus if we find another sample that calls this xsph.ru, we try to encode them in the vector space which are far from each other because there is hardly any similarity in the URLs. But if we find another sample which calls another set of RU domains, we will put them together. So this in turn helps in efficient clustering based on the proximity of the near similar features that we found. And finally, moving on to our modeling and clustering phase. So a little bit of intuition why we went for clustering. So we know that we have these unsupervised clustering algorithms and supervised classification. So for supervised classification, you need a really good ground truth labeling. You need good train and test data set. But in our situation, we do lack standardized ground truth label. And we saw it from our data set collection. And we know this in this community, we do lack this ground truth labeling. And we know that there are currently no proper data set for threat campaigns. So we chose the route for unsupervised clustering, which does not rely on external ground truth. It can infer patterns from the data within itself and can do the clustering from the inferred patterns within the data. So typically, we use this thing called agglomerative hierarchical clustering, which just clusters samples based on some distance metrics in a hierarchy. And that really helped us in doing this campaign attribution for executable and document files and group attribution for all the files. And this is a library available in scikit-learn. You can go there for more details, and it tells you how to run your algorithm once you have your features transformed. With that said, we come back to our evaluation phase, and that was some process. Again, to do robust evaluation, you need proper and right ground truths, because if I say that something is APT1, but ground truth is saying something else, then I don't have a right way of evaluating my results with what is currently available. So we had to do some work there to figure out how to do evaluation. And if you compare it with any supervised classification task, you have a train set and you have a test set. So we had to come up with something similar, even though we don't really have a concept of training and test, but we had to come up with a reference data set, which we call. And MITRE really helped us here. So if you are not aware, MITRE recently started tracking campaigns. Good for us. And it was just around the time when we started thinking about evaluating our system. We were just talking about how to do a quantitative evaluation. We can, of course, do a lot of case studies, qualitatively identify if we clustered samples together. But so in this campaign knowledge base, so MITRE already used to track groups, but there was no proper framework for campaigns. So we identified that, OK, this could be a good data set. We can create our own data set similar to test our results. And currently, interestingly, there are 24 campaigns, which is they are still working. But at the time when we were evaluating ADAPT, there were only 22 campaigns. So we worked with what we had. And I hope that they keep adding it to it, and it will be a good database and a knowledge base for identifying threat campaigns. So what we did was we reached out to all the threat reports associated with these campaigns and labeled them with the campaign ID, as you see here, the C0028, and identified the respective group as well. For these campaigns, they're usually in the threat groups. They have identified the associated threat groups. So now we had a proper data set, which is campaign and group labeled. So good for us. And once we had this reference or test data set that we call, we tested our results. And this is what, just like in any supervised classification task, you compare the clustering results with the ground truth, and we compared it in precision recall and F1 score. So when we identified campaigns for the executables, we got around 91% precision. For documents, we achieved a higher precision of 98%, where it could actually identify a document to the right campaign. And then for the group clustering, we got a precision of 84%. So while an F score of 80 to 90%, it sounds good, especially in unsupervised setting where you are not learning with the ground truth data, we also wanted to analyze how analysts could leverage this ADAPT in their workflow. And this will provide more of a practical understanding of ADAPT's capabilities. So a little bit to the fun side of it. We did some qualitative evaluation, and I'm going to take you through one case study that we identified and how ADAPT helped us there. In July 2020, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre released an advisory report, if you're not aware. So in that report, they identified that APT29 is targeting COVID-19 vaccine developers globally across different organizations in Canada, in UK, in US. And as a part of that campaign, in their report, they wrote that this APT29 was using the malware Wellmess and Wellmail, which are these lightweight malwares and are designed to execute arbitrary shell commands. They can upload or download files. But what was interesting was this group has been using this malware already since 2018. And we realized that the Japan Computer Emergency Response Team has already called out this malware Wellness, which was targeting Linux and Windows system in their organizations. But at that time, it was unattributed. It just said that it was a malware. We are being affected, so be aware. But it was only in 2020 when we were able to attribute it to APT29, which is the Russia's Foreign Intelligence Services. And what ADAPT did was, when we looked into our clustering and the samples, we realized that we had samples of Wellmess and Wellmail in our data set, which dated back since 2017. And we actually clustered them together to the same entity. And what helped us here, basically, we kind of streamlined and automated this process. We have both ELF and executable files, and we were able to cluster it to the same entity, ideally saying that they all belong to APT29. And what really helped us here are some of the features. When we went and looked into these samples and reverse engineered them, we realized that they were all using the Golang compiler. For both the ELF and the executable file types, so they had these Golang binaries, and then they were using this Yara signature called post HTTP form within all their samples, which helped us cluster them together. And finally, they were also using this elliptic curve cryptographic protocol, which is very peculiar, this curve 25519 in samples. And at places within the string contents, we also found encryption and decryption routines from RC6 cipher block. So what I'm trying to say is these distinct signatures and patterns have already been used by threat analysts in like manually analyzing, but ADAPT just streamlined the process of doing this by clustering these samples together and saying that they belong to the same threat group, irrespective of the file type. So you just throw the file type, it normalizes the features, transforms it, and clusters it, and gives you that they might belong to the same cluster. And we have more. So in the interest of time, I would not be covering all the case studies, and I would direct you to our paper again, because our paper covers another interesting case study from the North Korean APT group Lazarus, which was involved in the financial institution and Bitcoin currency stealing thing, and we were able to associate a lot of samples together. And we also had some cases of unattributed sample, which were able to cluster to a known threat group or threat actors. So again, once our paper is up there, feel free to explore and look into more interesting case studies that we cover there. With that said, what's next for us? So as I said, security practitioners from academia, we have attempted to address the complexities of attribution and APT attribution in specific. And as we strive to refine our approach, we are actually moving on into our next phase, which we call ADAPT 2.0. Again, sorry for the names. We have to be more creative, just like our industry is with APT tracking. So yes, in this ADAPT 2.0, we kind of want to initiate a knowledge exchange with cybersecurity professionals and experts like you who are working in this space, who are dealing with the complexities of APT attribution and attribution in general, and gain a deep insight like how you do it and how does your workflow looks like and what are the common challenges you deal with and what are the areas of improvement that we as researchers can help you solve them so we can all make a better and useful research prototype. So with that said, I invite you everyone to go to our project website. You can either scan the QR code or go to the link provided below, which is the secpriv.wien.adapt page. So we have our project website. It describes all the next phases of the research that we are embarking on and what we actually want. And you just need to give like an hour of your time to make us understand how, as researchers and industry professionals, we can come together and make this space and work together to kind of solve this problem of attribution and understand the complexities together. So with that said, I would be wrapping up my talk now with some of the key highlights that I think that we believe that are important to consider. So when it comes to attribution, we need to go towards a systematic attribution approach. We want to disassociate a threat campaign from a threat group. We want to identify how to properly name these things so we have a better approach to solving this problem. And finally, I also want to highlight the fact that we need to consider these diverse area of file types that have been present in this landscape, and we need to look at them holistically rather than just focusing on either executable and documents, and we need to develop some kind of a system that takes care of that. And as I said, from this ADAPT 2.0 research phase, we feel that an effective knowledge exchange between academia and industry can lead to impactful research prototypes, and we would be really happy if you can help us help you. Thank you, and hope you like my talk. I will be around here if you have any questions, and I guess we have some quite a lot of time to actually take questions. And again, this is the QR code for our project website. So yes. I'm ready to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. So I'm not advocating for not doing this in open source, but I cannot help myself from thinking of a vulnerability in this idea. What if a threat actor, an APT, starts using your open source models to optimize their stealthiness and being like adversarially enable themselves to be labeled as another APT in any campaign or intrusion they do?
Yes, very good question. So you're asking how our model could be adversarially used in favor of malicious actors. Yes, we have thought about that possibility, and that is a possibility with any machine learning-based solutions. Whenever you have these open source models, you always have this this idea attached to it that it can be exploited adversarially. So we would definitely think about this. Currently, we are still in the phase where we are trying to solve the problem, and definitely as next part of our research goes on, we are going to think about how we can have these ideas where, because I agree, we do use some lightweight features which are still could be modified to put in false flags, and if we use them to cluster them wrongly, then they might be attributed to some other groups. So we will think about this in our next research phase, that how to make it more robust against adversarial attacks, which is actually a part of our next research as well. And secondly, when we make these attribution claims, we are also kind of not really saying that this is the group that we have identified and take it as it is, like in its face value. We are also giving the features extracted that we have extracted from our raw data set, and we also ask the analyst to just verify the results, like the sample was clustered together, but looking at the feature, do you think, does it make sense, if they are together? So hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. It does answer it.
Thank you.
Hi, great talk. A couple questions. So what happens if, or have you tried applying this machine learning algorithm to, say, a database of goodware, like known good files? What happens there? And have you tried, for instance, applying it to like the VirusTotal fire hose and seeing, if anything interesting pops out there?
No, we haven't applied this to the goodware or the host that you mentioned. We only worked with APT data set, and which we know are malicious. So we have only applied it to the malicious data set. But interesting, we might give it a thought. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, really great presentation. I really liked it. I just had a question, because it's pretty common for most threat actors to kind of reuse similar code. So for example, if a threat actor is doing a certain process injection technique, several other threat actors are kind of using similar one. So when you do the features, wouldn't that impact the result of, the model itself? And do you guys do anything that, deals with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I mentioned the feature extraction, our feature extraction takes features from different parts of the samples, and we are not just focusing, which you mentioned, process injection. Of course, we have a lot of samples which triggered the Yara rule of process injection, but we have the string features as well. And when we combine these features together, they kind of work in tandem to make a decision. So it's not just one feature that is making the weighted decision for the model. So we have these metadata features, the string features, and the other specific API calls and other, they all come together to make a decision. So ideally, when you do machine learning, hopefully every feature's weight is counted, and it's not just the Yara rules that were triggered. And
how's the weight on the different features that you're using? Because I think from our perspective, it would be really interesting to have a really good way to actually perform that classification of malware. Yeah. But I just think it's a really difficult problem to solve. So
it is definitely this difficult, and especially we work with multi-class labels, so we are not just binary labeling. And when I showed the results, basically when you do a goodware and a malware detection, it's much easier in those cases because you have 0 or 1 label. But in our multi-class classification, there is always a possibility. So in our research, we have identified this possibility that we might give multi-label output as well, because we want to not say this sample belongs to, let's say, APTX, but we want to say with probability this sample belongs to APTX, but with 60% probability we also believe that this sample might belong to APTY. So we have that idea that maybe as a future work, which we might incorporate to identify, to give this kind of weightage of the label itself based on that clustering we have find, if a sample is close to one cluster, then we provide more weightage to that cluster, but we also identify the other labels it might come under.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your great talk. I just have a question regarding the, sometimes in the investigation, we need to have some dynamic action on the first malware. So, for example, recently we see there are lots of HTML smuggling coming to the clients, and you need to open it, then it will redirect you to some website. It is starting from Microsoft or some, for example, Google or whatever else. You can get some actually campaign for your advertising or whatever else, but threat actors are using it in a negative way. So you will be blocked by some reCAPTCHA or something from Cloudflare, and then you will be achieved to the final destination. So in these cases, is there any workaround for you to analyze them?
Yeah, no, great question. So about dynamic analysis, we haven't done dynamic analysis, and we agree that some samples do need dynamic analysis, because when I showed you the linking features, which are based on URLs and IP addresses, we did not get a lot of URLs and IP addresses statically, because very few samples have statically embedded those things within the content. So we do feel that for some of the samples, we need to do dynamic analysis, but with dynamic analysis, we need to take care of other limitations as well. I agree that this is a static analysis-based approach and it has its own limitation, but for dynamic analysis, we don't know if the sample is even going to show the right behavior, if the right system is not attained, and like which system works for you to show your true behavior, and the behavior, are we capturing even the right behavior? So we did balance those things that should we incorporate dynamic as well, but we will definitely consider in future. Currently, we just rely on static analysis, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, good presentation. Kind of regarding similar to the last question, but regarding packet samples.
Yeah.
Are you considering those samples, even though not doing dynamic analysis? Is any kind of external service being used to unpack those to put in a data set, or not at all? Are you considering the packet sample or virtualized sample, whatever?
Yeah. No, good question. So your question is, are we considering packed sample, and if we are, how we are unpacking them? Interestingly, in our data set, we did do an analysis, which is covered in the paper, that we try to identify how many of our samples are actually packed by just using the normal packawares like UPX and Themida and all those things. So interestingly, there were about, I'm forgetting the number, but about 10% of the samples that were packed by these commercially used packawares. So currently, we just have those numbers, and we are not really dealing with packed samples, and we take the packing mechanism as a feature as well, which feature they are using, and if we can extract any other information without like unpacking them. So no, like it comes into the phase of dynamic analysis and using more tools. But since we didn't have that many packed samples, we are not yet using any specific unpacking routine or unpacking version to make more features available. But that's definitely a part to be considered. Yeah.
And just last question.
Yeah.
So if you cannot unpack with known tools like QPX or whatever, you're not going to send this to the...
No, we still send them to our pipeline.
Still send?
Yes, we still send them to our pipeline. So what happens is, if you don't have enough features, they kind of become uniclusters, and they are not clustered together. But it might happen that specific packware that it's using might be available in another sample, which has very similar properties, and it might be clustered with only 2 samples, but we are not discarding anything. Either we end up getting uniclusters, or we get like 2 samples with clusters. So everything goes through the pipeline. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess that's all. Thank you so much for your questions, and hope you like. Thank you.